This is another rare one, kind of. Well, the story behind it is pretty interesting. This dates from 1966, and it's a Gibson Casino. Yes, I know, no such thing. Epiphone made casinos, not Gibson. Epiphone was owned by Gibson at the time, but their lines didn't cross. I think they probably made them at opposite ends of the factory. Quick recap. 1957, Gibson purchased Epiphone and moved its manufacturing from Queens, New York to Kalamazoo, Michigan. They kept producing elements of the Epiphone lineup for several years, and then gradually morphed it into a budget counterpart, but that process took some time. To a lot of people in the late 50s and early 60s, these brands were very much on par with each other. Epiphones were not necessarily seen as inferior, and there are several parts of the line that are virtual clones, except for some decorations. Gibson tried to push Epiphone sort of at the country and western market for a while, so you get a lot of cactus and pine needles, and acoustic guitars with names like the Texan or the Excelente. The Excelente is pretty much a Gibson Dove with a bigger headstock and Brazilian rosewood body, so that's not a down market item. Eventually they started farming out Epiphone production and finally moved it overseas at the beginning of the 1970s. But for a while there, you wouldn't feel embarrassed to appear on TV with one. The Casino model is a Beatle guitar. John and George played them in concert in '66. Paul owned one too. Don't see him very much with it though. Interestingly, both John and George stripped all the finish off theirs at some point to let the wood breathe, and they thought they noticed an improvement. This one here, the owner thought it was cherry. I believe this is probably burgundy, metallic burgundy, which is pretty nice.
There it is. Epiphone style designation and model on a Gibson label. And the headstock, when you see it, is a little bit different too.
So what the heck is a Gibson Casino? Indications point to it being an employee-built Frankenstein guitar. Now there's a history of one-off builds for employees in a lot of guitar shops. Sometimes it's a reward for time and service. I seem to recall Ren Ferguson mentioning when he was the head of the acoustic production in Bozeman in the 90s, they were still doing it. But certainly there are employee custom Martins and other brands as well. And it's also possible this was a totally unauthorized build made from stuff pilfered from the seconds pile, like that Johnny Cash song where he's working on an automotive assembly line and he makes himself a car from parts that he swipes and brings home. That happened too. Anyway, even without the serial number, we know it's an official Gibson because it's got the proper headstock break. This has most of the appointments of a Casino, which is essentially the same thing as a Gibson ES330 TD, thin line double pickup. This has got dog ear P90s. It's a fully hollow guitar. It doesn't have the central solid block that makes a ES335. The Gibson 330s often have a trapeze tailpiece, though sometimes you'll see people have converted them to a stop tailpiece. It's kind of risky because you're just dealing with a 1/4 inch of plywood here without that central support. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This one has an Epiphone Tremolo tune vibrato on it. Earlier Casinos often had Bigsby's. This is an Epiphone tailpiece that is missing the E emblem. There's usually an Epiphone E right in the middle there. I don't see any evidence of there ever having been one. The guitar also shows a number of mods that probably happened in the 70s, like a lot of these guitars. It's got a brass nut, which was big at the time, and it's got some Grover tuners replacements. These are patent pending, so they're pretty early.
When the current owner got it, it had been fitted with a set of humbuckers, but the imprint of the dog ears was still evident, and they'd actually left the screws in the top for us, which was nice of them. So he had a set of vintage P90s rewound and put in there. They look pretty good.
So what are we doing to this thing? It's time for a refret. These are pretty low. They're in the range of around 22 thousandths. The Tremolo tune, if we're being diplomatic, it's not a great vibrato. It's clunky, like most everyone Gibson tried to come up with. This one has an issue returning to 0. And the roller is very stiff. We'll see if we can lubricate it enough to get it moving. There's something that can happen in pickups with metal covers like these. They get a microphonic condition where they'll squeal at high volumes. It's very unmusical and kind of unnerving. The owner says that he can't play the opening to Revolution, which is a test of any Casino. These were wax potted by the person who did the rewind on them, In other words, the bobbins were dipped in a wax bath to keep the copper windings stationary and stable, but it seems the covers weren't done at the same time. Basically, a layer of wax holds the cover in position around the pole piece screws and the bobbins. It damps out the vibration. So we're going to try that. Now, being a fully hollow guitar, these can be more prone to feedback, which is a slightly different thing, but the vibrations from that feedback can intensify the microphonics. Sometimes they go hand in hand.
Put in the earplugs because I'm going to turn it up real loud. Refretting goes as I usually do it. I'll start by lightly scoring along each side. This slices off a disturbing cutlet of dried sludge, but it also tends to cut down on fingerboard chipping when I pull them out.
The fretboard is in pretty good shape. The divots aren't very deep. These frets have definitely been dressed down before. We're going to get rid of the nubbins on this one. Sometimes the ends on bound boards can be a little bit more tricky. Oftentimes there's some adhesive. It's not bad.
Taking off the fret nibs, there's an urge to round them over and blend them into the radiused profile along the binding edge, but it's important to resist that. What that does is leave the ends of the frets with no support under them, so you either have to build some up with super glue or something, or file them back, basically past the binding, which you'll regret on a narrow 1960s neck. Instead, I just dress off the top and it leaves a little landing for them to sit on. That extra real estate is important on a neck that's only 1 9/16 at the nut. The slots can be irregular and there can be debris down inside them, so I use my little scraping tool to true them up and make certain there's enough depth for the wire I intend to use as well. I'm using StewMac number 149 fret wire, which is about 103 thousandths wide, and it's a pretty good match for the semi-jumbo frets they were using in this period. I put on a radius that's just a hair tighter than the fingerboard. That helps keep the ends down tight. It's good practice to clean off the oily residue left from the forming dies using the manufacturing process. Ugh. It makes it easier to glue in place if that's what you do. Then I'll clip them to length, leaving them just a couple of millimeters long. I'll nip off the ends of the tangs so they'll clear the binding. There needs to be a tiny gap on either side because they'll lengthen a bit when they're pressed in and the extra radius flattens out. There's always a remnant of tang left which needs to be filed away. If you don't do it, it can appear as an irregularity on the ends of the frets when you're all done shaping them. I'll put a little bit of glue down in the slot. This keeps them stable over time and I think it actually adds to the tone. I'll knock in the ends. Then give them a squeeze with the fret jaws. Then clean up the excess and move on to the next one. When the glue's had a chance to dry, I'll clip off the ends flush with the binding. I'll use a file in a holder to again dress the ends of the frets and start to bevel them inward a little bit. Removing the tailpiece shows off some of the darker paint underneath. It's difficult to see the actual color of this thing on video. It's darker than it appears and less vibrant. We'll inspect this weird mechanism here. I'll soak everything down with penetrating lubricant. So here's the annoying part about this design. I don't have a lot of experience with these, but it seems to me this is probably held under tension by something like a clock spring or maybe a pair of them in opposition, wound up inside the barrel there. And either through fatigue or just design, there is a little bit of play. When it's at rest, you can pull up maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and it will not return to the 0 point unless you physically push it back down. I don't think this is serviceable. At the very least, that would require knocking out the tiny little drift pins and having the spring go springing across the shop. And I suspect getting them loaded back in might prove a big challenge. The bearing points on this have all been fleshed out and lubricated, so it's working as good as I can make it. But I think we have to live with this as sort of a quirk of the design. It's like a far more complicated and yet somehow less efficient Bigsby. The pickups have been installed in such a way that they don't quite cover the reminders of the humbuckers that were in there previously. And this neck pickup in particular, the screws are so loose in the holes that the threads have no purchase on the wood. And when I was hammering in the ends of the frets, it was literally leaping off the face of the guitar. So I took these out and wrapped it up. So that could be another source of unwanted vibration. I'm going to plug the holes and see if I can maybe reposition these over a millimeter or so, just to cover up the sort of stuff that's left over. Barely see the edge of the hole there from the humbucker and some of this stuff. Might be able to touch it up as well. I used a combination of different touch-up markers to darken the abraded areas and make them less visible. And then I put on a sealer coat of lacquer. Wax potting, what is it and why? Some people have asked. A guitar pickup involves a magnetic field, which extends over its coil, and the string vibrates within that field. The vibrations are transferred as an electrical signal to the amp. In the best case scenario, the only thing that would move in that system would be the string. Anytime you have parts in the pickup, and that could include the cover plate, which vibrate, that can affect the magnetic field and introduce noise, like a harmonic flutter, usually high-pitched. You notice it, if you tap on the covers, you can often make them create weird squealing noises. So the goal of potting is to lock all of those parts together so they don't move. It becomes a unified brick. And traditionally this is done with wax. Some manufacturers nowadays use epoxy resin. So when we say microphonic, it's not like you can speak into the pickup and hear your voice. You can't do the old, hey, good looking, we'll be back to pick you up later. But the vibrations from your voice might be enough to put the cover in motion and create aberrant sounds. Because the coils in this case have already been potted, I don't think it's necessary to completely detach the pickups and go through the whole process where we dunk them in a pot of melted wax. I just want to isolate and hold down the cover plates. They have been soldered on their ends, or soldered, but there's still some possibility that vibration is occurring between the screw heads and the cover plate. So, this is sort of added insurance. The wax I use is 100% paraffin. There are people who have special concoctions with beeswax and other additives. The idea is that the paraffin might be too brittle if it's used alone. It's just not an issue. Beeswax also melts at a slightly lower temperature. Theoretically, you could get wax hot enough to melt or distort plastic bobbins in the pickup if you were to immerse them. I do this at like 145 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, around 60 Celsius. It's not an issue. I've never melted a bobbin before. And in this case, I'll just be filling the cover plates with wax. This is going to act like a big heat sink and cool things off really quickly, so I'm just going to go with the paraffin. And because I'm going to be pouring melted wax into what is essentially a trough with 6 holes in the bottom of it, I'm going to apply some tape over there. It probably won't block all of the wax from coming through, but it should do something. Keep it from running too far. I'm also going to be doing this with the guitar carefully covered and, having something to prevent me from pouring wax onto the surface of the guitar if things get out of hand. Here's a little jar full of shavings of wax. Here it is, slowly coming up to temp, surrounded by water and sort of an ad hoc double boiler. And I keep an eye on it with a small thermometer. Sorry for the Batman angle. The pickup itself is actually propped up pretty carefully so it's level. I just pour in the wax. Little dribbles that escape on the base plate or overflow will come off pretty easily once it's cooled. The second verse is the same as the first. All in all, it was a pretty clean operation. Not too much to clean off. Let's talk about thin, whippy necks. This neck at rest has a pretty big back bow, but that is actually what's necessary so that under string tension it's going to pull up straight. This is why when you look at a lot of guitars from this era, you see some really bizarre frets, often very low, because people have tried to dress them without a neck jig of some kind to simulate the string tension. As the diagram shows, if I was to try and level the tops of the frets in this current state, you can see I'd remove a huge amount from the center of the board. And conversely, if I tried to use the truss rod to make it perfectly straight without the string tension, the ends of the boards would end up way too high. So you spend an awful lot of time after the fact chasing down weird buzzes, and more often than not, by the time you're done, you've lost like half the fret height. So a neck jig is important for this. I've strung it up, put it in the jig, adjusted it so that the surface of the fretboard is level with string tension, took off the strings, and now I know that whatever I do to the top of the frets will be maintained when I go and put the strings back on. The tops of the frets have been flattened a bit by leveling, so I need to go back and re-establish the crown. I like a 3-corner file for this. The corners have been ground so that they're safe. They're not going to cut up the fingerboard. And I just work both sides until the line of black Sharpie, which I've put on the top of the frets, gradually gets narrower and narrower so that there's just a thin line when I'm done. And the sides of the frets are sort of a rounded, domed shape. Polishing, polishing, polishing. Taking care of the ends of the frets. This is actually the first part of a longer procedure where I tape them up again and use abrasives and get them really nicely rounded. At this point I'm just knocking off the sharp corner which is hugging the edge of the binding. With the 2 outside strings on for reference, I can position the pickups and re-drill the screw holes I'd plugged earlier. With the increase in fret height, the nut is now just a little too low, so I'll shim it with some brass shim stock. And while I'm at it, I'll also take care of the bridge post holes, which were a little sloppy in terms of fit, so I made some tiny little bushings for that. That'll tighten things up enough. I'll knock out the nut, which seems to have been held in with some epoxy. I'll clean off the end of the fingerboard using a small chisel. I'll also make sure the mating surface is flat using a small file. Then I will scuff up the surface of the shim stock so that there'll be a decent bond. Brass does not glue all that great, even with super glue, but this will be enough. I'll just push that together for a few seconds and then trim off the excess overhang.
Alright, we're all set. It feels quite different now. I've mentioned this before, that refretting a guitar that previously had very worn out frets can create a serious change in the feel. In this case, the fret height has increased by something like 55%. So the strings are now farther away from the fretboard, and that's something you can notice. Even if, in this case, like the action hasn't changed at all. It's just the strings are now farther away from your palm when you're playing. When I first picked it up, the neck felt very small, like a banjo, and now it feels more like a guitar. It's still very narrow at the nut. This is something that is most contentious about Gibsons from this era. Some people can deal with it, others find it very uncomfortable to play. I'm okay with it. I certainly wouldn't want it any narrower than it is. So we'll plug it in and see what kind of noise it makes. I will say, the trem thing, total fail. I hate this design. It's not good. When he bought it, the owner said someone had stuffed the spring from a Bigsby under the end of the arm here to act as like a supplemental return, but the spring was sitting right on top of the finish. It's just going to tear through it. I think it's best to totally disregard this and just pretend like it doesn't have a bar, because it functions, but it's never going to come back to the same place. This being the end of December, I probably won't have a video for you to watch next week, and maybe not even the week after that, because I'm back to building the mandocello I was talking about at the beginning of the year, and I'm also coming up with some projects for 2022 that should be pretty interesting, maybe even some collaboration. We'll see. So if I don't see you, have yourself a safe and fantastic holiday, and we'll catch you in the new year.